News. My name's David.
And I'm Russell.
And it's probably good to be back.
It is always good to be back. How are you?
I'm alright.
I didn't think much of your squelch sound effect at the end of the last podcast. It was okay. The boing was good.
You've got to remember these are all free sound effects. Just downloaded off the internet.
Can you still buy this sort of banks of BBC sound effects? You know, you used to be.
I used to have a CD, didn't I?
Yeah. Well, they used to be able to buy LPs, couldn't you, of BBC sound effects?
I don't know.
Products of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
Yeah. Within a minute of starting the recording, we're already talking about the BBC. People will think we're obsessed.
We're obsessed with the BBC. Well, we did confess our love for the BBC.
You did.
Yeah, I just forced you into it, right? Yeah.
I've got a tattoo on my arm now. BBC.
Oh, no. So, spring has sprung?
Yes, we're into spring.
It was quite nice, actually, because when I came for the recording this evening, there was birds singing in the trees, which was, that's definitely a sign of things to come for the rest of the year. And I've just had to replace 2 springs in the back of my Czech-built car.
Have you?
Yes, it was very annoying and very expensive. More expensive than I thought. You know how you get springs with like a flattened end? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Apparently only Japanese cars have that. Nobody else bothers. So you just have a spring with like a sharp end, and then they wonder why the ends break off after like a certain amount of use. Because I must admit, I drove my car for a couple of weeks with this clunk at the back, thinking, "Oh, it's something loose in the boot. I must get around to that."
Actually, when I was in your car the other week, I heard the clunk, and I just assumed it was something in your boot.
Oh well.
Old news.
How can our listeners get in touch with us?
They can visit our website at www.oldnews.podbean.com. They can email us at oldnewspod@gmail.com. They can go to our Facebook page just by searching Old News Podcast. They can tweet us at Old News Pod. And we're on YouTube as well.
We're also on YouTube.
If you can find us.
YouTube is of course, the home of sane and rational commentary.
Yeah. Any commentary at all on ours would be nice.
Would be great. We noticed we have had a few new people like the Facebook page over the last few weeks.
Yes.
And some
welcome
to you. I think a lot of our listenership up to now has been people we kind of know or friends of friends, and it seems we're starting to build a little bit of an audience outside of that. So yeah, please do get in touch. It'd be great to get to know what you think.
Old news.
I was just going to say the bee is back.
The beer is back, and it is, of course, the beer of indeterminate strength.
I think I know which one this is and from which batch as well.
Which one is it? Go on.
I believe this is what we called Mook Stout, but I think this was Mook Stout 3.0, which was the last stout we did, and we didn't have quite enough treacle. Because, you know, you put treacle in stout.
It is quite nice, actually.
Yeah, I think you can taste the treacle, but as I say, it wasn't. We didn't have enough of it in this batch.
Yeah, it is quite. But it still has a sweetness to it. Although the sweetness can be a sign of alcohol content as well.
Yeah, which is.
Can't count it. And for our listeners across the pond, treacle is another word for molasses. Because I assume it's black treacle.
Yes, it was black treacle. Yeah. Is that just molasses?
I think it is molasses. Yeah.
Right.
Because we tend to think of treacle can sometimes also be golden syrup.
Yes.
Golden syrup has a name in the States that I can't remember. Is that what they call inverted syrup?
I have no idea.
Yeah, where you invert the sugar or something. I don't know. I'd have to look it up.
I've heard the term inverting sugar. I have no idea what it means.
Yeah, it's something to do with converting fructose and something. I don't know. So I think that leads us quite nicely in today's.
Does it really from sugar to what we're going to talk about?
Not really. Well, they have beer there.
From beer, yeah, okay.
Yeah, they have beer there.
Right,
they're quite good at beer. Most famous beer from that part of the world, I suppose, is probably
the original
Budweiser. Yeah, the proper Budweiser, not the American stuff.
Yeah.
It's old news.
Yeah, so today we're talking about what?
The breakup of Czechoslovakia.
Yes, which is sort of a little bit of a functional title. We could have called this the far more poetic, the Velvet Divorce, which is kind of how it's known in those countries and in history. But is perhaps a little bit less descriptive to the average browser of podcast apps. So we'd like to talk about this breakup today because we thought it kind of passed into history very quickly, and I think it got drowned out by other things in the end in that sort of era, because it happened on the 1st of January 1993.
Yeah.
So the build up to it was kind of in the post-communist era, up to 1991, 1992, when all the big decisions were made, and then in 1993, stroke of midnight, it happened. It sort of happens in the background of the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
And the utter sort of disaster that was.
Yeah. Also the breakup of the Soviet Union. You've got Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and so on.
Yeah, and that's all still sort of happening. Yeah, it's sort of in the interim period in 1991, isn't it? And I think because it happened peaceably in a kind of democratic way, or perhaps not so democratic.
As we'll find out.
We should probably talk about that. Yeah, it got forgotten about, but I think a breakup of two countries that work together, I think, is quite prescient to talk about it at the moment, and we'll maybe get to that at the end, where we look at more sort of comparisons. So you looked a little bit at the early history of Czechoslovakia, and how did these two countries end up together as a country in the first place?
Yeah. So at the end of World War One, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was pulled apart or fell apart, depending on your point of view, and these two provinces, areas of the empire, were pushed together. Interestingly, it was kind of all agreed in the Pennsylvania Agreement.
Yeah.
Interestingly, in 1917, so before the end of the war, before the empire had collapsed.
I find this a very strange. I did have a quick look. I really can't find anything similar like that certainly in that era where expatriate communities have decided to come together to declare independence from a colonial power in the homeland, but then come together like this. You'd think this would be a prime opportunity for nationalists and nationalists in exile to declare independence of their own patch.
Yeah.
And of course, the other country that's created at the same time is Yugoslavia, isn't it? There's a whole bunch of other Austro-Hungarian provinces that are pushed together in one country, whether it makes sense or not. Here's a question I was just thinking about before. Is there any kind of real religious differences between the Czech Republic and Slovakia?
I don't know.
No, I don't know either. That's something I haven't looked up. It's interesting that if you look at the various groups that signed the declaration in Pennsylvania, it includes an evangelical group and a Catholic group. So it's kind of multifaceted. Mm-hmm. Protestants, I suppose, but they call themselves the evangelical. Whereas the Yugoslavian Federation was just a mismatch of all kinds of different folk and
just pushed together. Yeah.
So you've got this country that's kind of artificially created and survives for quite a while.
Yeah. So up until, from 1918, the end of the war, until 1938. What surprised me, it was a democratic republic. I had it in my mind it was probably a sort of like a democratic kingdom, something set up in a similar way to the
Yugoslavs.
Or the Yugoslavs, yeah.
The Yugoslavs had a king, didn't they?
Had a king, yeah. But no, an actual democratic republic.
Yeah.
With a president.
And it's interesting, in that era up to sort of between the wars, they were a little bit like Weimar Germany in a way. They're a country which has no democracy up till that point, really, and then suddenly democracy is thrust upon them, and it takes root very, very easily.
Yeah.
Democracy is really sort of embraced by an awful lot of folk, and they're a beacon of democracy, and they're a beacon of economic development in that part of the world as well.
Yeah. Of course, World War II happens. The Slovaks, under the influence of Nazi Germany, have their own state. The Czech side of things is occupied. We'll not go into that too much.
Yeah, sort of. It's occupied in two stages, isn't it? With the Sudeten land first, and then the actual invasion.
After World War II, it becomes a communist country. A federal style, starts off as the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, but then becomes a proper federal republic with separate Czech Socialist Republic and Slovak Socialist Republics.
So you've got this period of the communist government. Doesn't it start as kind of a unitary state?
Yeah.
And then in 1968 you have all the events of the Prague Spring.
Yeah.
which is sort of just to kind of quickly revisit that. There's a brief period of loosening of the communist regime, and they offer what's the phrase, the slogan, socialism with a human face. Who's the chap who led that? The Prague Spring? Dubček. But he gets ousted. I mean, the Soviet Union invade. Well, it's actually the Warsaw Pact.
It's the Warsaw Pact, yes.
Yeah, so it's not just the Soviet Union, it's them and some of the neighbouring countries with their support invade, and it leads to this process of what's called normalization, which is basically a reimposition of hardline communist government.
Yeah.
But then we get this federative setup of the two socialist republics.
Old news.
Should we go on now to look at a little bit sort of how it happened and
the split itself,
that sort of process? Because you got this period from starting in 1989 and then into sort of the early 90s, and you get this increasing sort of call from nationalists on the Slovak side, saying that the country is imbalanced. All the decisions are made in Prague. Prague doesn't care about us. This all sounds very familiar in some ways, isn't it? It's the same appeal that kind of nationalist politics makes all
everywhere,
the time. Yeah. There's also some external force that says we can't do what we want to do. Yeah, we're not the masters of our own future. One of the things that is unique in this is that it is largely driven by the politicians.
Yeah. One thing I came across, and it's, to be honest, I just came across this on the Wikipedia page. Always your starting point for this kind of thing. But in a poll taken in 1992, the number of people who were wanting to split, there was only 37% of Slovaks and 36% of Czechs wanted to split.
So minorities on both sides.
Yeah. Quite small minorities as well, really.
Yeah. Here's the thing, right? But if you ignored that minority, I mean, you say they're small, they're a quarter of the populations or a third of the populations, respectively. Do you think if we'd ignored them, or if they'd been ignored for a long time, that would have gotten more and more bitter?
I suppose it possibly could have. That's the trajectory nationalism seems to take, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it starts off small and gets bigger and bigger and bitterer and bitterer.
Yeah.
I think you're probably right. It did seem to me, reading up on it, that it was driven by politicians who seemed to not be able to get off the train. We've started this thing rolling.
Yeah,
and once it was stop.
Yeah, once it was in motion, it was sort of going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. One of the last things I did as a student was I was involved in a sort of European-wide student event, helping organise it. And we had quite a lot of students come from both the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And these were all people who I kind of got to know and, were acquainted with for a short period. And any discussion of this, and this is kind of students in their late teens, early 20s, they still said that, oh, well, we don't understand why it happened. We don't know why. We don't understand. And it seemed like there was a huge amount of regret.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that these were people who were probably only very small children, 9, 10, 11 years old, when it happened. And there was still like a sadness about it as well, when you talked. But obviously that's a very narrow section of society. That's the kind of somewhat probably well-to-do, the well-educated, young professional class. I wonder if you were to go onto the street in Bratislava and Prague, or the provincial cities, would you find the same attitudes? Yeah. I'm curious. So you've got this thing, and because uniquely they don't hold a referendum. It is all led by politicians, and presumably the referendum doesn't happen because it would be totally unclear.
Yeah,
as to how.
You, as a Democrat living in a country that's had quite a few referendums in the recent past over very different things, you think, well, surely they should have had a referendum.
Yeah.
But in a country like that, that's only made up of two parts. One part of which is significantly larger than the other. There's two problems with it. What happens if only one of the two states chooses to be independent?
Yeah.
Which, let's face it, was more likely than not to happen because the independence feeling was much stronger in Slovakia. But also the other problem is because there was twice as many people, almost exactly, in the Czech side, they could absolutely drown out the other side.
Yeah, the vote could have been a lot stronger. This is always a problem of the way you draw boundaries around people, isn't it? And a very similar situation, I suppose, is Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
in that if you were to poll the island of Ireland what they think, well, it would be very clearly in favour of one thing. But if you just pull the two things separately, then you get a different result on either side.
Yeah.
So, which is more legitimate? The answer is it's always just a political solution, isn't it? One of the things I thought was really interesting, that once the deed was done, there's this process which is very well recognised now of successor states. I mean, the best example is the Soviet Union and Russia. So when the Soviet Union breaks up, obviously all the various states that form the USSR break off, but it's actually the Russian Federation that takes the place of the USSR.
Yeah.
So they get their seat on the United Security Council.
They keep the same seat in the UN in general.
Yeah,
all the treaty agreements.
Yeah, the treaty obligations, etc.
Yeah, all fall on Russia.
Whereas they agreed to not have a successor state.
Yeah.
And the Czechoslovakia just ceased to exist. And then two new entities were created and then joined the United Nations as
two separate entities.
Separate entities. Although they did both agree to take on the treaty obligations of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So neither one of them had to suddenly sign up to all the different treaties. Yeah.
But it's interesting how in people's minds, I think a lot of people see the Czech Republic as the...
Yeah, I think
the
that's probably
state.
just because of the word Czech, that in the flag.
And they agreed not to use the flag.
Yeah.
Originally.
Would you rather cheeky?
It is, isn't it? It's we're going to write all this down and say we're not going to do this, because they agreed not to use any of the flags or symbolism or anything of the old state, and the Czech Republic went, nah.
Yeah, well, we're keeping this one.
So we've kind of delved somewhat there into some of the causes of what drives this. There's another side to it, and there's quite a lot of commentary about, well, actually there's a Czech nationalism in the background. It's not maybe called that at that point, but there's a lot of Czechs saying, well, Slovakia is very economically undeveloped in comparison. They're much more agricultural,
agrarian economy.
Agrarian, I suppose. And you might say, well, we're just hemorrhaging money, and so like people say, oh well, we're cutting off a dead limb.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds awfully familiar as an English person in the UK.
Yeah.
Did he read anything about the hyphen war?
Is that the Czecho-Slovakian?
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't read it as named the hyphen war, but I did come across something about it. Yes.
The Slovaks wanted the hyphen. They wanted that there would be the Czecho-Slovakia Federative Republic or whatever. There's a whole history of like which way they go, and the Czech media just thinks it's hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
It's hilarious and provincial and silly, and what do you want to do that for? And of course, all that does is just inflame sentiment in Slovakia, because they say, well, we want to be treated as equals. This is meant to be a partnership.
Yeah.
I'm not, if I was a Slovakian nationalist, I can see why they wanted the hyphen, even though I think it's like a minor issue. But the moment the Czechs start laughing at you and say that it's not important, I can well understand why that would just annoy you.
Yeah.
Like, even as a moderate, I think it would just annoy me, because it's deeply patronising. And then there's this ridiculous thing where they temporarily agreed to have two different names for the country depending on the language you would speaking in. And then, of course, there was actually a difference between hyphen and dash, and that in Slovakian that's an important distinction.
Right.
And in Czech it isn't, it's the same thing. So then there was a debate about, well, are we using a hyphen or are we using a dash? Because one is for like joining two things together and the other one is for separating them.
Okay.
Because one is slightly longer than the other.
Right.
We have this in English, actually.
We just don't really
know about it. Yeah, we don't really notice it. So you can see why this sort of symbolic stuff becomes really important.
Old news.
Looking at one of the sources I had on the internet, they were talking about how the politics really changed between the two countries.
Mm-hmm.
So you got an election in 1992, just the last elections of the Czechoslovak state, and you end up with two very different sort of political spectrums in each country. So in the Czech side, you have like a conservative parties at one end, and you have like an unreformed communist party.
Yeah.
So the left is kind of hamstrung because they're still being represented by the kind of the hated old guard.
Yeah.
Whereas the other end of Slovakia, you've got authoritarian nationalists on one side, and on the other side you've got kind of a reformed democratic sort of left, social democratic.
It was still the old Communist Party, but it had reformed itself to a more, I suppose, socialist, probably more hardline socialist than we're used to.
Well, I suppose probably quite similar to the way in East Germany, the Socialist Unity Party, as it was, became the Party of Democratic Socialism.
Mm-hmm.
So it was still quite left, but like a much more committed to democracy kind of left, rather than kind of the old Stalinist old guard. Yeah. So you got this sort of difference, and of course that then reflects that when independence does come, the early history of Slovakia is
murky, to say the least.
Yeah, and you noticed something weird on Wikipedia. Well, I did as well.
You did as well, yeah. This is something I picked up. As we've discussed before, I tend not to do the research side of things. You do that, but today, because I had a bit of a free day, I decided to do some of the research. And obviously, your starting point's always Wikipedia, and it's not immediately noticeable. But when you start looking outside of Wikipedia, you realise that the Wikipedia page about the breakup of Czechoslovakia has quite obviously been written by a Slovakian.
It certainly has that slant.
Yeah, and everything that happened in Slovakia afterwards was all sweetness and light. But it wasn't.
It actually goes through this terrible period, doesn't it, of authoritarian nationalist government, which I think a lot of people were very scared of at the time. I was reading the New York Times article.
I think we might have read the same thing, written sort of on the day after the breakup.
On the day after the breakup, and it's sort of been met without the enthusiasm and so on. But I think it was interesting reading that through the lens of people like Slobodan Milosevic.
Yeah, that they were afraid it could go the same way.
Yeah,
the Hungarian minority in the country were quite worried.
Yeah, that's right. In that they had ended up being marginalised and becoming. But actually, what happens is it goes through this really sort of terrible dark period, and then the progressives take hold. Reforms have already been enacted, and then the progressives get hold of the government, but continue with economic reforms and do a reasonable fist of dealing with kind of ethnic minorities.
Yeah,
because once you've broken up Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic becomes very ethnically homogenous, with the exception of their Roma community, which is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
And then you've got Slovakia, which is smaller, but thereby more ethnically diverse, because they have the large Hungarian population.
Yeah.
But then you've got this problem with the Roma as well, haven't you? That again, see, this is the things that I think the EU were always really good at solving, because you had a large Roma population in the Czech Republic who were mostly Slovakian born, and so you ended with a large population that are stateless.
Yeah, which is a really strange situation to be in.
Yeah, and when these countries then started to look for EU membership, well, the EU said, there's no way we can accept you with such a large population that is stateless. And so they did the deals, and those Roma became Czech citizens.
Here, it's old news.
Could Czechoslovakia have been saved, is the title I've got next. The article I was looking at suggested two models, right? And the first one was Belgium.
Right.
David
Bull's face. Yeah.
Well, it's very easy just to say Belgium and everybody laughs, right? Because
it's the rudest word in the universe.
Well, it is, yes, of course. But also, like, largely ungovernable, or like famous for being ungovernable, or famous for having ridiculous power structures in order to try to accommodate everybody. And a lot of that centers around like the language politics, and people should be allowed to speak their own language and blah blah blah. But I guess the Belgium's still here.
Yeah, it hasn't absolutely imploded.
Wasn't that whole embarrassing bit when they went for 500 days without a government.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the fastest growing country in the EU economically in that period.
There's an advert for rugged individualism if I've ever heard one.
Well, there's an advert for having a civil service that just gets on with stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. Get rid of the meddling politicians.
Yeah. I think more interestingly is the other model they suggested was Canada. I suppose Canada works by being a loose
federation.
Yeah. Interesting, you hear these two words, federation and confederation. And I guess if I was a political scientist, I would instantly know what the difference is. I mean, presumably one is looser than the other.
Yeah, probably something we should have looked up, but...
Yeah. Well, I suppose the Canadian situation more or less works.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it often only works in that they have kind of unwritten rules, like the leader of the main political parties almost always has to be French speaking. That's not always true of the Conservative Party in Canada, but they should at least be able to speak French.
Mm-hmm.
If not be from Quebec.
Yeah.
Which kind of is the deal, isn't it? Because the French Canadians could say, well, we have this power of influence at the federal level, and in return we agree to be part of like a very dominantly Anglophone country. The Canadians are doing it on an informal level because that's just the way their politics works. But then you could, I think, if you was to sit down and write a constitution, you would end up probably having to codify all that stuff. So and so, the Prime Minister is Czech speaking, the President is Slovakian speaking.
Yeah. Which is the kind of thing that Lebanon famously fails to do constantly.
Yeah.
It's working at the moment.
It is, but only after a huge long impasse of not having a presidential election for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of setup never really works.
Yeah. And more closer to home, of course, is Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Who have the communitarian thing where all the members of the legislature have to be one thing or the other thing. Or none, but that has like a third status of like not being quite as influential. So yeah, it's kind of weird. So I'm not convinced that sort of solution would have worked. There does seem to be two schools of thought on this, isn't there, as to whether the breakup was inevitable or whether the breakup was not inevitable. I mean, where do you come down on that side of the debate?
I think because of human nature being what it is, I think it probably was inevitable. I think it didn't have to happen at the time it did, because, as I mentioned before, it does just seem to have been a bunch of politicians got on the train and couldn't stop. But, as we discussed before, there's this whole thing that nationalism seems to grow.
Are all federal structures doomed?
I don't think all federal structures are doomed. The United States being an example, I can't really see the United States falling apart.
No.
But that's probably to do with the way the Constitution was implemented and how the country has grown.
I suppose that's the States has been like an opt-in process bit by bit.
I suppose there's a difference between what you might call old European states to like New World states.
Which were largely built on immigrant populations coming in from the outside.
Yeah, so you've got like Brazil is a federal state. Mexico is a federal state.
Yeah,
these are things that are often forgotten about, but they're not likely to fall apart because the states themselves don't have a huge amount of national identity.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe and Asia and Africa, in a different way, but it's a similar sort of thing, you've got these people groupings who were just sort of bashed together, normally through conquest, into borders. So you get Spain is a sort of federal state, and it's constantly on the verge of falling apart.
Yeah.
Despite them having a really quite good constitution and quite good federal arrangement.
Yeah, and large amounts of independence for...
Yeah.
Or autonomy for different regions, yeah.
Essentially, we've all come from ancient tribes.
Yeah. I think if we look at our own backyard, though, I think it's interesting to look at how... obviously, England is very dominant in the UK. Well, there's one nation that's totally squashed in the UK.
Wales?
No, Cornwall.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that Cornwall were definitely seen as a separate nation at one time, had very much saw themselves as a nation of people. But now the idea of Cornish nationalism is like a very niche interest, and the vast majority of Cornish people see themselves as being regionally English. And Wales is similar in a way. They're not so far down that road. They maintain their own language. But Wales and England seem to have a much more sort of...
more integrated
existence.
Realistically, it's English and Welsh law. Wales wasn't an independent kingdom in the same way Scotland was.
But if you look at the way Scotland has maintained its separate laws all of this time, where is it that nationalism is now taking root more permanently than, say, it has in Wales and it's in Scotland? So I think that's I think federalism, like I support federalism in the UK. I will out myself as a federalist because I think it would make sense to have some sort of separate English representation. I might even go for regional representation rather than English just regions rather than English. Just England. But that's because I'm from the northeast. But yeah, I think federations on the whole tend to be political conveniences. The people who find themselves identifying with the federal identity most tend to be the dominant people.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it was in Czechoslovakia. The Czechs saw themselves as strongly Czechoslovakian, whereas Slovaks saw themselves as Slovaks co-equals in a Czechoslovak federation.
Yeah.
Which just seems like in some ways, like a lot of people would just hear that sentence and yawn and go, oh, what's the difference? But I think that question of identity is very, very important.
You would understand it more if you were Scottish or Welsh.
Yeah, for sure. I think the English are understanding it more and more, aren't they? As
it becomes more obvious that it could well happen.
It could happen to us. Yeah, and I think it's interesting how in the aftermath. You've actually in Czech Republic, or Czechia, as we should say now.
Yes, there was something we haven't talked about. This rebranding of a nation that I think is ridiculous, personally.
Well, it's actually quite strange because Czechia is only the registered short form. It's still the Czech Republic.
Right.
Yeah, weirdly. So it's kind of both. So I think generally in our in the British communications to the government, we would still refer to them as the Czech Republic. It would be only if they insisted that no, we want to change, then we would change our term. But yeah, because we need more countries ending in IA.
Yeah, yes. There's not enough of them.
Yeah. Oh dear. Which is where you get this ridiculous thing, because there's this endless confusion between Slovakia and Slovenia. Apparently, there's a lot of places where Slovakia and Slovenia have embassies in the same cities, and they often get each other's correspondence.
Yeah.
From different governments and organisations and things. And apparently, I think it's on Thursdays. Every Thursday, Slovakia and Slovenia have this informal sort of agreement that the officials get together and they swap items of post. And apparently this is in some ways tremendously useful, because occasionally you get letters from people you would rather not get letters from, and you can just say, we never received it.
Yeah.
Or it's a great way of delaying stuff, because you know that so-and-so has written a letter, but you can say, or if you want to embarrass somebody, you can say, well, you sent it to the wrong country, you fool.
Yeah.
I think the Slovenians who really are a smaller Central European country get very, very vexed at this. So just to look at kind of what's going on now, you've seen that essentially the economies of the two have balanced out slightly. I think Czech Republic's still a bit richer in terms of its sort of average incomes and things, but
the GDP of the two countries, I think Slovakia's is now 95% of the Czech Republic's.
Yeah.
So they're very close.
Yeah, presumably that's on a per capita basis. Yeah, because one is twice the size of the other. But I think it's really interesting to see the big debates about independence movements in Europe, and obviously in the UK it's all about Scotland at the moment, and it was a couple of years ago, and it is going to be again, with Brexit looming in the background. Of course, Spain, Catalonia.
Yeah.
As well, that's sort of rearing its head again, isn't it? They keep talking about having a referendum, and it nearly happened just recently, but didn't. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see whether those debates have the common sense to look at Czechoslovakia and see what happened. See whether they think if that's the route they want to go down.
Old news. Old news. Old news. Old news.
So I say good luck to both countries.
Yes,
and I think if ever there was an argument for kind of open borders and things, and a lot of the questions that came up when they split about, is this road in Slovakia or is this road in Czech Republic, and what about this school for this village? There's a load of this on the borders.
Yeah.
It all got sorted out, but now that the borders are open and people can freely travel and so on, then everybody gets their own country, but they get to live in a normal way at the borders.
Yeah.
Yeah, rather than having sort of this imposed wire fence. Maybe the future here is wire fences between us and Scotland.
Old news.
Right, so that was the breakup of
Czechoslovakia. So, I think we need to say thank you to some people.
Yes, our usual thank yous in this slot. Firstly, of course, for our fantastic intro and outro music, royalty free, from bensound.com under Creative Commons license. And of course to the great Peter Kitson for the use of his voice.
Well, I think that's it. See you all next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Coming up next time on Old News,
Louisiana and Hurricane Katrina, in which you'll hear David say,
Gadzooks!
And,
But the ducks! The ducks!